Really an honor to be here in between these two distinguished guests. And we're going to start more in the modern world. First, I want to ask actually a question. How many people know somebody who is intermarried? How many people have somebody within their either immediate or extended family who is intermarried? So we're all here for the same reason. And I want to share with you a story actually of Keruv, of outreach, that I tried 2 years ago here at Sinai Temple. There was an interfaith couple in our preschool. The mother was not Jewish, the children were Jewish, and the father was. And I thought this mother was becoming very involved within the preschool, and I asked Rabbi Wolpe if she could serve on the Purim Carnival Committee. And he said, sure, why not? So before I was about to pick up the phone and call her, I got a phone call to call this woman. I said, hello. And I was about to ask her to serve on our committee as somebody who was not Jewish here at Sinai Temple. And she said, I would like to convert to Judaism. She ruined my plan. But, as you said, we all know people within our own family, within our own community, who have interfaith relationships and interfaith marriages. This evening we're going to discuss, as you saw in the flyer, whether it is a threat, a challenge, or perhaps an opportunity, specifically and not specifically within our own conservative movement and in the Jewish world as well. So we're going to begin first with perhaps opening statements from our guests. They come from various backgrounds, and then I'll ask some questions that will hopefully show us how interfaith marriage is approached within their communities, both at the Hillel at UCLA, also within the Rabbinical School of the American Jewish University, and as Rabbi Artson sees rabbis going into the field, what that will look like in the future as well. So, we'll begin with Rabbi Artson. We'll begin with Rabbi Artson. As the Dean of the Rabbinical School ordaining conservative rabbis, what is the approach that rabbinical students come into the school with based on now their experiences in their own Jewish experience? And what do you see after 5 years, this new crop of students, if you wish? What do you see the future course for them?
So first of all, I just want to say it's very nice to be here and not have it be Rosh Hashanah. Not that I got anything against Rosh Hashanah. Second, I want to tell you that I will be one of the scholars at APAC this year for the Shabbat and for the conference. So, thank you. So for some of you that may be a reason not to come to the conference, but I want to tell you it's a big conference. You can avoid me the whole time.
You count as one of our delegation.
I'd be happy to.
We're trying to be KJ in New York.
Aren't we all? So, one of the realities of the conservative movement is that we try very hard to hold on to the tradition, but to keep the tradition in conversation with contemporary reality. And that makes us the most challenging movement in some ways. It's easier if your answer is, I'll look it up, and whatever we did in the past, that's what we're going to do. Or if your answer is, whatever we feel like doing, that's what we'll do. But to be on the one hand bound by Jewish tradition and precedent, and at the same time also consider ourselves part of and bound by contemporary cultural norms, means we're always having conversations that make us each uncomfortable in different directions. So within my lifetime, when I went to rabbinical school, people were yelling at each other about women in the rabbinate and in the cantorate. And then when we got bored at yelling at that one, then we started to yell at each other about gays in marriage and in the clergy. And this is the new one of those issues, which is that the world has moved so rapidly and in so striking a way that we're left figuring out what to do. I can tell you that it's a standard of the rabbinical school that our students are not allowed to be married to or dating a non-Jew. And the one exception we've made to that is if the non-Jew is already in the process of converting, then we will allow the student to be admitted into the program. But I will also tell you that in the last 5 years, I've had students come say to me, the only way I can be part of the conservative movement is to tell you up front that I will be advocating for the movement to change its stand on intermarriage. That is to say, I have rabbinical students who won't drive on Shabbat, who are fully Shomer Shabbat, and who think it is a serious religious mistake not to officiate at intermarriages. I'm going to try very hard not to take a position on anything so that I can walk out of here intact. So I'm just going to report that I don't see that going away. This summer, I was in conversation with, may I talk about the letter a bit? Yeah. So I'm part of a thing called the Quartet, which is the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, the Jewish Theological Seminary, the Rabbinical Assembly, and United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. The four heads of those organizations, which are the four largest organizations in conservative Judaism, we meet through Zoom or Skype 4 or 5 times a year, just to have conversations. It's never happened in the history of the conservative movement before. It's actually a sign of remarkable progress. We're getting along. We play nicely together, and we even talk about substance sometimes. So we started talking about intermarriage, and we realized that we needed to put out some kind of a joint statement to clarify where we stand. And so I was volunteered to write that, and it was a pastoral letter that was sent out to every conservative rabbi, cantor, leadership of United Synagogue, Women's League, Men's Club, signed by the Chancellor of JTS, the head of the Rabbinical Assembly, the head of United Synagogue, and myself. And we can talk about the content of the letter later, but what I want to share with you is that it has, rather than shutting down a conversation, launched a conversation. I was bombarded by phone calls from conservative rabbis all around the world. All of whom, as you can imagine, have very strong feelings on the subject, alas, without consensus. So it is clear to me that the conservative movement, without any idea of where this is leading, is entering into a period of robust conversation. And I guess my plea to us, as has been my plea across this continent, and frankly in Europe and Israel too, is that as we express our opinions, we practice respecting each other at the same time. We don't question each other's motives. We don't accuse each other of destroying the tradition or of fighting human dignity. We listen to each other. We listen to each other's life testimony. We listen to the way we do Jewish and the way we read Judaism. We listen to each other's fears and concerns, and we postpone policy. Because right now we're so fractured that if we do anything, we will do it the way we did women and gays, which was to say badly and with a maximum of hurt feelings. And so I would rather we take 5 years just to learn together, talk together, listen to each other, read sociological studies, read rabbinic writings, read scripture on this subject, learn what wisdom our tradition has to offer, and then from there, perhaps a consensus might emerge over time. But we're nowhere close to that consensus right now, and so the best we can do is speak lovingly to each other with passion, advocating as best we can the positions we hold, but with enough humility to realize we have something to learn from people who don't agree with us and remaining open to what they might have to say.
What about for those who say 5 years is too long in terms of their own family, in terms of their own relationship, not just with each other, but also with the synagogue? In 5 years, so as part of my role here, I work with membership, and our membership VP is here tonight. We're losing people because 5 years is too long. How do we respond to that in the moment?
So in the moment, here's the good news for you. No matter what you do, you're going to lose people. That's very liberating, right? If he does start doing intermarriages, there'll be a whole bunch of people who he'll lose, and if he doesn't do intermarriage, there'll be people. So the nice thing about that is you're kind of free to do whatever you want. The more serious answer is that we haven't yet talked about attending intermarriage, which is very different than officiating at an intermarriage. The letter that I wrote comes out in favor of attending. And the movement as a whole is on the brink of clarifying that that is completely permissible. Indeed, in the history of conservative Judaism, no rabbi has ever been disciplined for attending an intermarriage. So you are allowed to show love and support to a couple. You are allowed to be there with them. You might even be allowed to speak words of love and support at some point, so long as you're not doing anything that officiates at the ceremony, nothing in the rabbi's manual. So that you can do already. And couples are welcome to be members of the shul. I think the challenge has been, honestly, we've not been very good at welcome. And that means we've focused all of our energy on do we officiate or not, because that's an easy one to measure, but it doesn't solve the problem. If you officiate and don't really welcome, you haven't solved the problem either. So I think it's worth slowing down the policy changes. It's worth thinking this through. What are the implications? What are the consequences? What do we gain? What do we lose? How do we minimize the losses if we are going to make a change? If we're not going to make a change, how do we maximize the welcome? There are big questions we have to face. How does this shape our relationship to the Orthodox community? How does this have an impact on our relationship to the Jewish community in Israel and in Europe, even to the Masorti communities in Israel and in Europe, which have very different sociological realities to what's happening in the United States? What about our relationship to the conservative movement in Canada? There are big questions that have to be talked about, and I'm a big believer, as is Jewish tradition, in open-ended conversation. So I think that really would be, if we could get our colleagues and our communities to be truly welcoming and loving to the couples, and help maximize their lives so that they are as Jewish as they want to be, walking with them every step of the way, that ultimately the question of do we officiate formally or not is not going to make or break in the next 5 years. And if at the end of 5 years there's an emerging consensus that allows everything that conservative Judaism stands for to remain strong and vibrant, I think those will have been 5 years well spent.
So you mentioned the Orthodox, so we'll turn to Orthodox Rabbi in our panel. Rabbi Lerner, who is, of course, the executive director of UCLA Hillel, which deals with a pluralistic community. So first, perhaps you can share a bit about your upbringing as Peter introduced you as a product of an interfaith marriage. There was a fascinating article that Rabbi Lerner wrote a couple of months ago saying, and that's when I reached out to him, saying that the intermarriage conversation on campus doesn't exist, basically. So perhaps you can explain your upbringing and then why you came to that conclusion by working on the college campus.
Sure, and I joined Rabbi Artson and really being delighted to be here. I'm actually here every day with my daughters. I have 2 daughters, one in the ECC and one in first grade right now, so if you are in that same boat, feel free to come and say hi in the hall. I would love to see you. I think the most interesting place to probably jump off would be from the remarks about a welcoming community and the constraints of being part of a denomination versus the sort of non-constraints of being part of, let's say, a Hillel or a non-denominational, fully pluralistic space. So what do I mean by pluralistic? Pluralism means that not only is everybody sort of welcome and tolerated, but there's actually a celebration of difference in our space. So, on the second floor of Hillel on a Friday night, you'll have about 40 or 50 students who are praying in an Orthodox service with a mechitza, men and women separate, very traditional service. All of those students walk by a larger service on the first floor where there may be a female rabbi who's playing guitar, with a bunch of students who come from Reform and conservative backgrounds. Those students then walk past the Orthodox minyan right upstairs, and all of those students may have disagreements with each other about what they've seen, right? Orthodox students might be like, I really don't like what I saw downstairs, but I'll deal with it because I've got my thing upstairs. And then when those, liberal students walk past the Orthodox minyan, they might say, I really don't like that separation of men and women. But you know what? On the third floor, everybody's going to come and they're going to have dinner together. And they're going to sit together, and they're going to celebrate together. And really, Pluralism 2.0 in that kind of context is getting people to say, you know what, I disagree with you about what I saw downstairs, but God, I love your music, right? Like, I wish that we could have a guitar upstairs as part of my service. And I want those people from the downstairs service to be able to walk by the Orthodox service and say to themselves, I actually disagree with the way that you're excluding women from ritual in your space, but I really appreciate the literacy in your community, right? I really appreciate that I see you people sitting and learning, and that you know the difference between Moses and Abraham, because I may not necessarily know the difference, right? But in a pluralistic community, we're all coming together, and the differences exist, right? Amongst my students, there are students who would say, I absolutely would not marry somebody who just has a Jewish dad, or somebody who just has a Jewish grandparent. Part of the conversation in Hillel around these issues actually changed with birthright. So birthright in 2001 started taking students to Israel. Nobody really knew what it was or what it was going to become. They've now taken hundreds and hundreds of thousands of young people to Israel. But birthright elected to use the law of return as their standard for who could go on the trip. So the law of return states that if you have one Jewish grandparent, you can make aliyah to Israel. You may not necessarily be able to make aliyah as a Jew, which means that in Israel right now you wouldn't be able to get married or buried in Israel and some other ritual things. You would be restrained from being able to partake in. But you can make aliyah, you can go on birthright. And birthright really created a kind of renaissance in Hillel, where you had all of these people coming out of the woodwork who said, oh, I've got a Jewish grandparent. And I actually was one of those people. Right, so I was at USC Hillel from 1998 to 2002. I come from a family where my dad is Jewish, my mom is not. Both of them, I think, actually came from similar boring religions. So my father from really insipid conservative Judaism on Long Island, where he didn't understand what was happening, never really had meaningful Shabbat experiences, prayed in a language that he didn't understand that was really from the old country, and didn't necessarily have a deep appreciation for any reason to stay Jewish. And my mother, who actually grew up in a Greek Orthodox house, where it was the same thing, right?
That's why you're Orthodox, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm Orthodox. So these two people meet, and in the hunger for meaning, sort of post being hippies, decide actually that they want to become religious and become religious Christians of all things. Right, so you have two people who were not strongly rooted in the religions of their children, who become strongly rooted in a religion that has a personal relationship with God, that prays in English, that has a supportive community, that has a lot of the kinds of things that their communities, that their really traditional communities, didn't necessarily have growing up. I grew up with 5 brothers and sisters, four brothers and sisters in my family. Sometimes we had a Christmas tree, sometimes we had a Hanukkah. We celebrated Passover every year, but sometimes Jesus made an appearance at the Passover Seder. So they deliberately tried to kind of blend those two identities, which, as a college student arriving in 1998 at a Hillel, was eventually anathema to that Hillel. What do I mean? I mean that I came in as somebody who knew stuff, right? Christians read the Bible. So I'd read the Bible like 3 times. I knew more than any other Jewish student at Hillel, about everything Jewish. So they were super excited to have a guy named Aaron Benjamin Lerner walking into their Hillel. They invited me to be on the board. And for me, in my own life, I was already in religious exploration mode and identity exploration mode, which is what 18 to 22-year-olds are doing generally. But I felt like I had to, and so I had not really shared any of this with the Hillel folks. But I felt like I had to share it with them. And it became immediately clear that that was a red line that, we now have gone from feeling like you could have a lot to offer to this community to actually saying we don't really want you in this community. And I was kind of pushed out until there was a new executive director who came in. I tried again. I actually wound up going on Birthright. Birthright today would not let me go on the trip, and that's something else to sort of be discussed. But you see this change in 2001 where Hillels begin to take in everybody who's got some kind of Jewish connection. And in many ways actually stopped asking the question about whether or not people's moms are Jewish, which is what would make you sort of halachically or traditionally Jewish. The Reform movement before that starts accepting people from patrilineal descent. If your father's Jewish and you're practicing as a Jew, they will also consider you Jewish. But by the early 2000s, these are not issues. So I think as we go through our time together, it'll be interesting to paint a picture for you of what a community looks like that is welcoming of all of these different types of folks. I'll tell you just the key points. One, it's large. So Hillel at UCLA probably in 1998 had a couple of hundred students who would come around. They were students who really wanted to learn. They were people who were probably coming from Jewish houses. Maybe a few people who didn't go to day school, didn't go to camp, et cetera, were sort of found on campus. But we've grown 900% since 1998. I have a customer relations management software that tracks everybody who comes into the building, what they participate in, who they're friends with, the last time we saw them, whether or not they've been to Israel, birthright eligibility, all of that stuff. And I have 1,800 current students, right, who are actually involved with us at least one time during the year. And we track them to see how many times they're involved through the year. So by creating that kind of welcoming environment and stopping asking a lot of the kind of threshold questions that might have kept people out of our community, we've actually grown exponentially.
So I want to go back to the idea of welcoming. If we are saying no to officiating, and I'm not off that topic yet, then what does it mean to be welcoming? For instance, if the non-Jewish parent cannot have an aliyah or an honor on the bima, etc., how does it feel, or how can we make them welcoming when we are still exclusive in ritual? How does welcoming and not being welcoming in ritual work together or not?
So, look, to answer that, I need to broaden the parameters of what we're talking about. If Judaism were a hobby like stamp collecting, then you clearly would say anyone who wants to collect stamps, come and collect stamps. Because all it is an activity. But I don't think we've yet come to that, and I hope we never do. I hope that we understand that what Judaism is a specific covenant with God. And if that's the case, then distinguishing between people who want to be a member of the covenant and people who don't choose to be a member of the covenant, I want to very strongly say this. I will express this opinion tonight. I don't think this is a human rights issue. I don't think this is a civil liberties issue. I think that not letting someone be a rabbi because they're a woman, that's a civil rights issue. That's a human dignity issue. Saying to a gay person, you can never love somebody, you can never be committed to somebody, there's no solution at hand. But there is a solution at hand to a non-Jew who wants to live a Jewish life, right? And I think we need to be really going the distance to make it as easy as possible for anyone who wants to participate as a member of the Jewish community to do that. But here's where I want to say something unpopular in America at large. It may still be popular at Sinai. I think people are responsible for the choices they make. And so I'm not prepared to say that someone can go to a rabbi and say, I want unleaded and check my tires. You know, I think people can say, I want to be Jewish, and then I as a rabbi can say, here's what Judaism offers you. So someone who wants to live a Jewishly engaged life and be part of the Jewish community, okay, I run the country's largest introduction to Judaism program. We convert thousands of people a year who come to us and say, we want to be Jewish. And we make it as easy as possible for them to do that. But what do you do with someone who says, for whatever legitimate reason, I love someone Jewish. I want to spend my life with that Jewish person. I'm even willing to have our kids be Jewish, but I myself am not willing to become Jewish. And here I want to phrase this in psychological language. How do we honor that choice? Did you get that? How do we honor that choice? If someone chooses not to link their destiny with that of the Jewish people in their personal identity, then I want to say to them, that's a completely legitimate choice. God knows there are several times a day that I don't want to link my identity with the Jewish people too. But if you choose to not identify with the Jewish people, then you're choosing not to be a member of the covenant, and then I want to honor that choice. Having an aliyah is not like collecting stamps. It's not like just learning a song that we can all sing together. It's the service of God within our covenant. I would never go to a Catholic church and demand the right to take communion. To take communion, you should be a member of that church and you should be serving Jesus. And I don't, so I would expect them to welcome me. Welcome means smile at me, be nice to me, sit with me, explain what page we're on, invite me to join them for lunch where I probably can't eat very much. You know, I expect, and so we don't do a good job of that, right? And here's because I think we carry with us an internalized fear of Gentiles, some degree of legitimate anger, for, let's admit it, they weren't always great to us over the last, 2,000 years. So we worry about being invaded. We worry about being undermined. We worry that it's a surreptitious way to win us over and make us walk away from our Jewishness. I think those are legitimate concerns, but I don't think we can afford to give in to them anymore. So what welcome means is just welcome. Now, here's the part that no clergy likes when I give this answer. Part of the challenge is we have built bureaucratic institutions so that the clergy don't have time to be welcoming to anybody. Right? If you go to Chabad, some of you do, you know what welcoming looks like. And nobody expects Chabad to change their standards of ritual practice. They just know that whoever you are, you're going to be really welcome. You're going to eat a whole lot more cholent than you probably should. And the rabbi or the rebbitzin is going to sit with you and talk to you and get to know you. The challenge that we have is in the liberal Jewish movements, we've built institutions that are so onerous that the clergy doesn't have time to go have coffee with everybody. They don't have time to meet you at a restaurant or have you to their home. They're drowning in chores and tasks and assignments that they have to do. So part of what's involved is having the non-Orthodox communities redefine what it is we want our clergy spending their time doing and how many clergy members do it take. Because I think you all need actually more rabbis and cantors than you currently have, and then you need to free them up to do the things that only they can do. Because if they're doing something someone else can do, then they're wasting their time, because they're not doing the stuff that they only could be doing.
And on the college campus, when we're talking about 18 to 21-year-olds in that transformative time of their lives, you and your experience at USC, you somehow decided to go back after perhaps not being welcomed. How does that look like in your world, and when they come to you saying, I didn't know that my situation even looked like this because I grew up in a blended environment? What does that look like in the real life of a Hillel rabbi?
So I wonder if perhaps, and I'm not sure, if we disagree about the definition of what it means to be a Jew. But for my students and for me, Judaism was an identity. And for some people, that's a religious identity, maybe related to God, maybe related to a covenant with some kind of ethereal being, or some kind of covenant of peoplehood. But most college students, when they're journeying through their exodus from your houses into college, and then out the other side into their own lives of adulthood are trying to figure out who they are, right? Like, who the heck am I? And they've got a lot of inputs, right? They've got all of the inputs that you gave them from 0 to 18, and now they're getting a lot more inputs. They're getting academic input, they're getting input from their friends, but some of the fundamental questions that they're asking are about where do I belong? What do I want my life to look like? Who's my social group? Where do I feel most comfortable? And I think that for me, I started asking a lot of those questions in high school, and I realized that especially growing up in a fundamentalist evangelical kind of place in Texas, like I remember asking people, I said, so wait, the fact that my grandfather's he's a good guy, but he doesn't believe in somebody who didn't, who lived 2,000 years ago, like he goes to hell? And the fundamentalists have no choice, the Christians have no choice but to say, like, yeah, if you don't believe in Jesus, like, you go to hell. I felt like theologically that made no sense. And then I think I looked around and I saw that I didn't really fit in the Christian circles, and then I saw that I really did fit in the Jewish circles. So I did BBYO, I did some nifty stuff, I was like getting more involved. And so I felt Jewish, right? Like I felt a deeper identity connection to being Jewish, in addition to the religious piece, because I also have the religious piece, but many of our students don't have the religious piece. They have the sense of belonging, of family, of ancestry, of Jewish DNA, of something that exists outside of and maybe even non-inclusive of a God relationship with their Judaism.
So before we open up the Q&A,
I don't think we disagree on this. I do think we come from very different places, so my autobiography was, I'm a pure-blood Jew, all the way back to the protoplasmic sludge. We were Jewish all the way back. But I grew up a complete atheist in San Francisco. And I am as American as a person can be, by which I mean my closest friends in grade school, who are my closest friends to this day, is Martin Kohut, who's a Czech Italian-American, and not Jewish, and Hans Boldoff, who's on his father's side German, really German, and his mother was from the Weicker family, which is as blue blood Connecticut as one can be. These were my buddies growing up, and I grew up eating, trust me, everything, and never going to a synagogue, and when I went to Harvard, which is as American as a college can get, and I would then tell people what the second verse in Latin for Adeste Fideles is at Christmas time. Like, I know American and Western culture. That's where I'm not comfortable with you people. But what pushed me into Jewish community was I found the God of the Torah, who picked me up and changed my life. Now, I know that's idiosyncratic, but I just want to put on the table, there's a fair number of kids out there whose identity is fine, thank you very much, but what's going to land them in a Jewish life is some religious convictions, not just a sense of identity, because my identity, honest to God, I'm really fine mingling with the blue bloods of New England. I'm okay. What I want to say to us as a community is one of the choices that's facing us is what happens when policy no longer achieves its goal. And that's different than how do you feel about something. So let me give you my favorite and most troubling example these days. In the Talmud, the rabbis terminated the practice of capital punishment when murder became too common. I'm going to say that again. They ended the practice of capital punishment when murder became common. Because it makes sense. If nobody's killing anybody, then the threat of we're going to kill you if you do it, that's a very reasonable threat that focuses people's attention and would stop them from otherwise murdering. But if everyone's murdering anyway, then simply threatening to not murder, well, you're not accomplishing your goal. And the only reason to have capital punishment is because it's achieving a goal. right? So the rabbis understood if it's not achieving its goal, it has no justification. So the question we need to struggle with as a community, and I'm not suggesting I know the answer, but I want us to think about. The policy against intermarriage came about in a time when the intermarriage rate was 3%, where the rabbi saying, you're going to destroy the Jewish people if you intermarry, so then nobody did it. Like, people listened and they stopped. I have some news for you people. Rabbi Wolf is out of the country, right? All right, so let's just keep this among ourselves, please. Nobody's listening to what the rabbis have to say on this subject anymore. They're just not, right? So rabbis choosing to not officiate at intermarriage, it's not that that policy is then stopping people from intermarrying. Right? Now, it still may be a reason, there may be other reasons to maintain that policy. I don't want to weigh into that now, but I do want to say we need to be asking ourselves the really painful question. Is the goal to make a policy statement that doesn't lead to the goals we want? Or is the goal to maximize Jewish living? In which case the question becomes a very different question. What policy will deliver the most people to the most meaningful Jewish life possible? That's, I think, the only question worth addressing. That's why I don't think we disagree. And good people will differ on what the answer to that question is, but that's the question that we, as a conservative movement, need to be seriously talking about.
So based on that new question, my final question is based on the title of this evening: Intermarriage, opportunity, challenge, or threat? And then we'll open it up. None of the above, all of the above?
Yes.
Yes. I think that was the point of this evening.
What we haven't really covered is statistics, right? So it does turn out that statistically, and we always have to be able to segregate statistics from individuals, right? So just because if you come from a family with one Jewish parent, you are less likely to raise Jewish kids. That is true statistically. So from that standpoint, right, threat. However, what's really interesting in the Pew study is that as communities become more welcoming, there are more and more families with one Jewish parent who are raising their kids as Jews. In fact, 59% now of millennials, which is my generation on college campuses right now, people who are sort of 18 to 26, 59% of the people with one Jewish parent consider themselves Jewish. And that's directly correlated, and I think in a causal relationship, with the welcoming environment that they've received in the last 2 decades in the Jewish community, as opposed to the previous generations when many fewer people are associated. So if you go back to Gen X, it goes way down. And if you go back even further to the Boomers, people with one Jewish parent, like only 25% of them still consider themselves to be Jews. So the only real opportunity in my mind is genetics, right? That if we really do live in this. Did you use slush pool or something for the DNA of Jews that go back 10, 15, 20 generations? Like, that's actually really problematic as a Homo sapien, right? So just separate ourselves from for a minute religion and think about ourselves as genetic beings. Like that can be very problematic. So it may be that there's really opportunity there.
Before we have a Q&A, just a couple of things that were referenced that might be worth your reading. You can email me or contact me. I'm happy to get you these documents. First is the article that Rabbi Artson referred to, Covenantal Love and Responsibility, which is put out by our conservative movement. A really fascinating document to read. And also in the foreword, 22 rabbis of different denominations and post-denominational and non-denominational were asked this question as well, and they have brief answers about what they think as well. Very interesting read. So we're going to ask for the next 10 minutes or so Q&A.